Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles podcast. Today is Thursday, July 20th, and I'm recording in Ocean Park, Maine. A couple of days ago, when I was back in Cambridge on July 18th, I had a chance to interview by Zoom a young author. He's in his early 30s, Andrew Ridker, and he's just published his second novel by Penguin, and his earlier novel, which was published in 2019, was a great debut. It was favorably reviewed in the New York Times and elsewhere, and this book has also gotten some very strong reviews. The earlier book's title is The Altruists, and you'll hear Andrew talk about it in our interview. The New York Times review of his new book, which is titled Hope, on July 10th, it had a great headline. It said, "An open marriage, a bad decision, and a grandmother who needs cash." In his riotous new novel, Hope, Andrew Ridker finds the humor in a family's plummet from grace. And there's a brisk description of the plot of the book, and the ending of the review I want to read to you. Ultimately, as implied by his titles, Ridker is an optimist. His characters make mistakes, but they pay the price, recover, and grow. Under skies, quote, "the color of cheap red wine, comma, feeling a woman's beauty, quote, like a bullet in his side, they soldier on and try not to lose hope, just as we hold ours that this talented writer will keep gifting us with his intelligent, big-hearted, spew-your-gefilte-fish funny novels." So I would say Andrew is off to a very strong start. He's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is kind of the premier MFA program for writers. He clearly spent his time well there and is having a lot of fun writing these novels. So let's turn now to the interview. At the end of it, I want to tell you about one particular part of the conversation that we had that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since we had it in a couple of days. And I've been talking about it on my morning journal, the flash briefing that I do for Alexa each weekday. So we'll talk about that and have a few more comments after the interview. Here is Andrew Ridker talking with me on July 10th. Let's start telling my listeners about the family of Scott and Deb Greenspan and their kids, Gideon and Maya. Actually, and I'm recording 5.5 miles from Brookline here. I'm in Cambridge.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I can almost feel their presence here. But what should we know about this family to start getting into the story?
Well, this is a little bit more of a local reference, but I would describe them as the quintessential Brookline family, which is to say they are a sort of family of Jewish, upper middle class, academic professionals who care deeply about social justice and making the world a better place. They're also a relatively privileged family who live in, a nice home in an expensive neighborhood. They believe in public schools and the public good, but they also are insulated a bit by their own privilege. And I guess I would say, in terms of what to know about them for getting into the book, they're the kind of family who appears to have everything together from the outside. But once you start digging in, you see all these different ways in which there are cracks in the facade, so to speak. And the book in some ways is a big what if question of what if a family like the Greenspans, which is a little bit to say what if a family like mine went completely off the rails as a result of one or two or three bad decisions, and what would that say about not just the family but the country at large?
And how about their kids, Gideon and Maya? What's good to know about them?
Yeah, Gideon and Maya are the sort of millennial offspring of Scott and Deb, and they were raised on the same values that they were raised on the values that Scott and Deb gave them, of these sort of like good liberal values, also like sense of meritocracy and just work hard and go to college and life will be a breeze. And then, like many millennials, after graduating college, they come to find the world isn't quite set up that way. And Maya is working in a publishing house, which is sort of like killing her idealism as an English major. And Gideon is trying to become like his father and become a doctor as well. But when his father enters this scandal, it forces him to question everything that he's doing with his life, and he winds up in some pretty hairy situations as a result. So they're almost like the living embodiment of what happens when you take this set of values and then adapt them to this contemporary moment. Do they hold up? Do they not? And spoiler alert, they don't. They don't really. So yeah.
And the moment is 2013, 10 years ago, and that's also when you set your first novel, The Altruists. But when you were writing that novel, you were pretty close to 2013. You didn't really know what was happening. And I saw something you'd said, I think, in another interview. There was sort of a ghostly epilogue to this story, because when we look back at that time, we know what happened: COVID, Trump, everything. What else is significant about this story set in that year, 2013?
I tend, as a writer, to really be attracted to the theme of disillusionment, which is sort of the flip side of hope, of course. What happens when those hopes don't pan out? And it felt, like you said, that first book, it was an attempt in some ways to write a very of the moment zeitgeisty novel, but of course it takes a couple of years to write a book, it takes a couple of years to publish a book, and by the time the book came out, it came out under Trump, and it almost had become this historical, moment, even though I was writing it to be about the present day. And with this book, I was attracted to that time. I still wanted to write about that time, but like you said, now I knew where it was going, and I could actually treat it like the, in some ways, historical era that it was. So it was this funny process of doing research about a time that I lived through and about a time that had just ended, but the Trump years so violently gave shape to the Obama years that suddenly we could talk about the Obama years as meaning something distinct. So it was kind of an effort to look back and say, what was going on in Obama's America that me and people like me were either too complacent, optimistic maybe, self-satisfied, naive? What did we miss, and how did we get from there to here? I wrote this book in my hometown of Brookline, where the book is set, but during quarantine. So it was almost like the last time I was in this house, I was an optimistic 17-year-old. Obama was president. I'm going off to college. And now I'm in this house, and you can't even go outside without a mask and gloves. So how did we get here? And it felt a little maybe both too easy and too difficult to write about the Trump era. It was unfolding in the moment. It was too crazy. But also it felt like just pinning the blame on him. And what's the point? No, I'm not going to convert anyone with this book. So I started looking back, saying what was going on in liberal Brookline, Massachusetts in the Obama years that we might have missed, and why am I back under these circumstances?
As I heard you talk about that, it made me think of 10 years from now, 2033. Mm-hmm. And I could imagine you writing a book set in 2023. And when you went back and you said, things weren't as good in 2013 as you and me and many others thought. Do you think there's any chance that 10 years from now, when you're writing your maybe fourth or fifth novel, the similar story might be, it turned out things weren't as bad in 2023 as everyone assumed, that somehow there was a kernel of maybe hope, to use your title, that wasn't really being seen because everybody was so much in this trance of negativity. Right. That actually could be, over the next 10 years, a radically different story.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that we look back and see this moment as a little panicky or a little overly negative. I think there are plenty of good reasons to panic, but I also think that one of the reasons I struggled to write about the Trump era while the Trump era was happening, and, knock on wood, won't happen again, was that we were all in this heightened state of alert. And it's very hard to know if those feelings will last, which is not to say he didn't do a million terrible things, because he did, but that there were some books that came out in recent years set during that time or set around the 2016 election. And originally, a version of this book was going to be set around that time, actually. And some of those books, it almost felt like they didn't age well, even by the time they'd come out, not because there wasn't real cause for concern around the 2016 election, but because that heightened state of panic, we just weren't there anymore. We were in a different state of panic, maybe for a different set of reasons, but it was not, for all the damage Trump wrought, it was not necessarily the end of democracy as we knew it, which was very much the feeling at the time. So I think very few writers, I think I can list on one hand, a friend of mine, Lee Cole's book, Groundskeeping, Ali Smith, the Scottish author, her seasonal quartet. Some authors have been able to talk about that time in a real way that feels like I'm taking you back to that panic, and it also doesn't feel stale. But a lot of books that have come out feel like, like maybe we had good reason to panic, but the books are panicking themselves or something. So I certainly would hope that 10 years from now, that would be my take, and that I would think things were maybe a little better. Someone asked me at an event recently, do you have hope for the future? Which is another way of asking that question, I suppose. And on the one hand, I kind of want to say no, things are pretty dire. But then on the other hand, I think, well, if I didn't have hope for the future, I wouldn't be getting up in the morning and writing and publishing and doing all this stuff. So clearly, in all of us, we believe we have hope because we have to,
Yeah. I think you mentioned that your father's reaction to the Altruists was, this is a really Jewish book. And I think that you were surprised by that because it wasn't an explicit part of that story. It's been a week since the book has been published. First of all, when you write about your family in such a, it's obviously a lot out of your family. Do they get to read the book in draft before it's published, or do they read it with the rest of us?
I'm very lucky to have an immediate nuclear family that is pretty observant of the sort of fiction reality firewall. And my parents sort of say, write whatever, like, we don't want to get in the way. What private feelings they may have, I can't say, but they've been really wonderful about not sort of hemming me in. I will say, too, what's funny, I'm almost in this worst case scenario where the characters borrow so many surface level details from my family. My father's a doctor. The father in this book's a doctor. My mother, my sister, there's a lot of these parallels. But in their characters' souls, they really aren't like my family at all. And so there's a funny way in which I make them seem a lot more like my family than they are because they wear the same clothes as my family, so to speak. But in their hearts, they're very different. And so I think my parents can sort of recognize that and see that and go, all right, he's kind of poking some fun, or he's using our synagogue, or he's using this local grocery store, or what have you, but they know they're not those people. And I'm very lucky to have at least an immediate family that respects that. So my dad, for instance, read an early draft because I needed his help writing the medical section. I was like, what would a doctor do in this situation? What's the role of a pharmaceutical company here? So in some ways, my parents have been collaborators in a way that I think is very rare and lucky.
Boy, I'll say that's amazing.
Yeah.
Class and money are in this book in a way that, and you said you wished there were more current novels that addressed class and money in a more direct way, as opposed to just a story of the crazy rich and a story of people at the other end of the spectrum. I guess I wondered, because you are very interested in that topic, and it was, I'm sure, part of your approach to this story, did you learn anything about class and money by writing this story that you didn't know before you followed the Greenspans on their journey?
I think I learned things that I knew to be true intellectually, but hadn't fully digested emotionally. Things like, they'll sound a little bit banal because, again, it's the kind of thing you hear all the time, but it's different to really feel it. This idea that no matter where you are on the class spectrum, you always feel like you're not high enough. You're always looking at the person above you, thinking, no one looks below them and says, I'm so well off compared to these people. We all look at the group above and go, why don't I have what they have? And, there are some moments when I was drafting this book thinking, I hope people will be able to sympathize with and understand these characters, because even though compared to a big chunk of the population, they're very well off, no one even millionaires and billionaires, maybe billionaires, but even millionaires don't think of themselves as well off. And there's a million articles you can read about, people with 4 kids in private school in Manhattan and a boat and a second home and a third home. And they're like, oh, I'm not rich, not me. And so I've always been interested in money, both as a plot device, because it really gets characters moving, but also just as that broader theme, like we're all existing on the class spectrum and no one's quite happy where they are. And I'm just sort of fascinated by, it's almost like however much you have to begin with is irrelevant, and not irrelevant to your life or society, but irrelevant to the decisions you'll go on to make. So the idea that you have to be broke to make a desperate financial decision, I think is nonsense. I think there are people in the upper middle class who make desperate financial decisions all the time, just on a different scale. And what's broke to them is not broke to someone who's maybe actually broke. And so I feel that, every novel or every story, money plays a big role, whether it's explicit or implicit. And for me, I'm just making explicit the forces that are hanging around most books. Like whenever you're reading a novel and a character is at a private high school or a private university or a public university, or they work in this job or they work in that job, you don't always hear about salaries, or you don't always hear about money trouble, but that stuff is hanging over all of our lives. And I feel that even if it's a little embarrassing sometimes to admit to being in a class that, people might not be sympathetic to, it's important to explore all the aspects of that dynamic, because our lives are so governed by money, and the family money, intersection, the amount that money dictates like our relationships to each other. Even like, do you go on this vacation with your parents because maybe they'll pay for it and you couldn't go to this place otherwise, but then you're kind of under their thumb because they pay, these little silly things like that. Money and family are just always on my mind, I guess. But
yeah, and I think that one thing you do in this story, which unleashes the importance of money, is you take the Greenspans from, looking like a pretty fortunate situation economically, and all of a sudden, because of Scott's cutting a corner, they are in a completely different place. And I've got a little bit of that going on in my own family, because I grew up, my father was very successful in business, and he recently died at 96. And so all of his estate is now flowing through our family. Right. And it's a lot of money. I'll just say it. I mean, talking things I wouldn't normally say, it's like talking about sex. I'd rather tell you about my sex life than my money life. Exactly. But it has just thrown the family into turmoil. We're all questioning our roles, and I'm kind of the patriarch. Does that mean I have to be like my father and all of his, benefits? So I think that's maybe some of the power of the book, is to the extent you identify with the Greenspans, you have a chance to imagine what it would be like, and you would see how much money meant to your life when there's either a whole bunch that comes your way or what you have is taken away, because otherwise you're just kind of on autopilot.
Yeah, it's occurring to me as you say that, that in my last book, in the Altruists, it was the inverse of hope in a sense, and closer to what you're experiencing now, where the matriarch dies and money gets passed on, and the way that it turns the family inside out, as everyone has a different idea of what it's for. Do you save it? Do you spend it? Do you give it away because you feel like it's unearned? All these different permutations. And in this case, as you've mentioned, this is about a family that suddenly experiences an economic drop-off. But both cases, you find out things about yourself and people in your family that are not always pleasant. And I almost feel like if every book asks something of a reader, like maybe this book is particularly long, or maybe the language is challenging, or maybe it's Lolita and it's asking you to sympathize with a pedophile. Every book might ask something of the reader to say, if you can get on board with this one thing, I'll take it from here. I think what I'm asking of the reader in some ways is, you need to be okay with thinking about your own financial situation and the complicated feelings about that. I think it's really funny you said you'd rather talk about sex, because I think that's my wife and I often say, money feels like this final taboo. You can talk about anything, but you would never ask someone what they make. I mean, you would never do it. And I don't know that that's going to change. And so I think if you approach the book from an attitude of, oh, these people are upper middle class and comfortable, I don't care what happens to them, or if they get bumped from upper middle to middle or lower middle, who cares? And I understand that, but I think if you're willing to, see some of yourself in these characters and the way that money turns us inside out, that's kind of my ask. And I think it'll be a different experience if people are willing to sort of embrace that taboo instead of pretending like it's other people's problem, but not mine,
Yeah, and the other thing that I've heard you say that's important to you is that you want the book to be entertaining, to be a good read, and and I think you succeed in this. It's a page turner. I want to find out what happens, but to have an ask or a question embedded in that, it's almost as if you forget that you have a question you're trying to impose on the reader, you're just trying to tell a good story. You're just trying to make it fun for us as the reader. Right. The question that's eating at you maybe has a way to come out in the story that doesn't feel heavy-handed. It's just, how can you not have sort of your favorite problems show up in a story that you're telling? And so when you get through writing the story, do you have that sense of, oh, wow, I see, Jewishness there, or I see this there, I see money and class there, that when you step back, is there kind of a pleasant or maybe discomforting sense of what you really revealed?
Yeah, I think, I don't even know if I describe it as, that's a perfect way that you just described of the way that I think your sort of subconscious obsessions just come out whether you like it or not. And probably the best thing to do is get out of the way and let them manifest in those subtle ways, because you certainly wouldn't want to sit down to write a novel with an agenda, with a point to make. But if you sort of follow your intuition, you wind up making those arguments implicitly. But I don't know that I'd say it's pleasurable or discomforting as much as it almost I don't think making art is therapy, and I don't approach it that way, but I think something they have in common, especially with a sort of classic analysis model of therapy, is if you just kind of talk long enough or write long enough, those things find their way out. And you can step back after finishing a book and go, oh, I guess I am really interested in that, even if I didn't fully realize it. So some topics like, class or money, I know from the beginning, I think about that all the time. It's going to find its way in. But I remember, in much the same way that with my first book, my dad was sort of the one to tell me it was a Jewish book. I remember my mom read it and she said, it strikes me that this book is a lot about loneliness. And loneliness was not at all a theme that was top of mind, conscious mind. While I was writing it, I wasn't even thinking about it. And then when I went back and read it with that in mind, I started seeing the word lonely crop up everywhere. I started seeing characters grappling with loneliness, even if that wasn't the central problem in their lives. So there's also a funny way in which, sometimes it takes someone else to read and go, it's almost like I've been listening to your therapy transcripts and it sounds like you're kind of hung up on this, and you go, oh yeah, I guess I am. Maybe it could be discomforting, but I find it just interesting to be able to realize I'm obsessed with something I didn't know I was obsessed with,
And was your mother's comment, was that about the Altruists or about this book?
That was about the Altruists, yeah.
Yeah. How about power? I've heard you say some interesting things that in any relationship, power plays more of a role than people want to admit. And sometimes, like in Deb's, the woman that she falls in love with, has power over her in some ways, but she's not as wealthy. And was that something which you found yourself revealing yourself to yourself in this story?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so cynical to say that the power dynamics in a relationship, that there's always some imbalance of power, and that imbalance is guiding the relationship in some way. But I think it's often true, and in my writing, because I write in it's realism, but it's slightly comically exaggerated, I get to take these theories I have and make them a little more blown up to investigate. So in my life, if I'm having an interaction with someone and I feel that there's a power dynamic at play, but it's kind of quiet and it's kind of under the surface and I'm not sure, the novel gives me a chance to make that more explicit. So as you mentioned, Deb, she's in this relationship with her husband, Scott. And you could argue that he has a certain form of power because he's the breadwinner. He's the one that works. And then she experiments with this poet who it has a power over her because she's an independent artistic soul, which is always what Deb wanted to be. But then you could argue Deb has the power over her because she has much more financial security. And it sort of unspools in this way. The daughter, Maya, gets involved with her high school English teacher. He has a certain power over her when she's young, because he's her teacher. Later in life, though, she works in publishing and he's got a novel he wants to get published, so she has a power over him. And he's trying to wield his old power over her in this, even though she has the power. So it was kind of a way to dramatize in a louder way some of these dynamics that I think are often at play. Obviously, the ideal relationship is one in which those forces are, if not balanced, then sort of off the table, in a sense. You're not thinking about them a lot. But they certainly come up, and I just like exploring what happens when two people are talking, but there's a whole subtextual conversation going on underneath about, well, someone here has the money or someone here has the authority. And in a way, the end of this conversation is a little bit predetermined by that. And how is that going to shape the conversation itself?
Yeah, I was thinking when I was taking some notes on that, an author interview by a podcaster or somebody at WGBH or something. Where do you think the power lies between those two roles?
That's so funny. I think that's actually such a good example too, because it cuts every way, right? Like, is the guest the honored guest who is supposed to be made comfortable, and I'm the one answering the questions, so I feel like I have some authority over my own book, but then I'm on your show, and this is your comfort zone and not mine. And I think it's that trade-off is there. I think it's sort of like, and I think actually it really illustrates well that there's usually not one clear answer where it's like this person has the power over that person, as much as it is you have different forms of power over each other. And, there's ways in which I'm sure you're comfortable that I'm not, and I'm comfortable that you are around this conversation. And, at the risk of, it reminds me of, you get into some dark corners of the internet with like pickup artists and those kind of guys. And they're the ones who say there's power dynamics at play. Now here's how to take advantage of them. And my feeling is, yes, there are those dynamics at play, but we're constantly exchanging power and what types of power we have. And the best thing we can do is like step off our pedestals and try to meet somewhere in between, as opposed to manipulating whatever authority we may have over each other.
Yeah. That's subtle. Enjoy that. Well, let's make sure you have time for your next chance to share power with an interviewer. I have been speaking with Andrew Ridker, author of his second novel, Hope, which was published July 11th by Penguin. Thanks, Andrew. It was a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I really enjoyed that interview from start to finish, but the part that has stuck with me over the last 2 days is the question of power and how it's a kind of a subtext in probably all relationships, but it's seldom acknowledged. It's just, you kind of vaguely sense it. And my experience in asking that question of Andrew, what has he learned about who has the power in an author interview, the author or the interviewer? His answer was fascinating to me. But what I noticed even more was that when that question was on the table and we were both kind of looking at it and kind of wondering, well, I wonder what the power dynamics are in this conversation that we're having now. It was as if we stepped off our pedestals or wherever we were standing in our own sense of our power, and we're just looking at each other on Zoom as equals. And it was delightful. There was a real freedom to it that made me think becoming more conscious of power relationships maybe often gives rise to a sense of freedom and a kind of a cleansing of a relationship of those things which distort it that have to do with power. And I've had a couple of, I had an interesting conversation with my grandson James, who's 17, that's how, let's see, was that how old he was when he wrote his... No, he wrote his earlier novel in his 20s, but in 2013, Andrew was 17. That made me think of James. But James heard me talk about this in my morning journal flash briefing for Alexa, and he said, well, you didn't mention that men have power over women, that's just something that's built in. And of course he's right. You have, millennia or centuries of patriarchal control in most cultures. And so when a man is talking with a woman or is married to a woman, that is certainly part of the power dynamics, which you can unpack and work with. I think if James has a little more experience with relationships, and he may find that women very frequently have more power in a marriage or relationship on any given day. But then the other thing I realized is how changeable the power dynamics are, because there are some times when I'm kind of on top of the world. I've done my sitting. I've sat out on the beach here and on the bench where I used to have conversations with Dad, and I've got my power. And so, and if I'm talking to my wife Darlene, it's coming from that place. And if she's feeling good, we're just sort of talking from equal places. If one of us is feeling too puffed up, and I'll say that's frequently me, because I'll come off the beach with some grand new theory of life and consider myself, if not enlightened, then pretty close to it. And then reality comes crashing in, and she'll say something, and I'll find out that I guess I'm not that enlightened yet. So in those settings where I can kind of sense that I am a little full of myself, maybe I'm feeling like the patriarch of the family or whatever, I can dial it down just by letting that thought be entertained as I'm getting ready for a conversation or in the midst of it. And then other times when I'm depressed and I'm down and I don't think I'll do a terrible job in this interview, then there's a kind of a lifting up so that I'm ready to go into it. And that reminded me of something a friend of mine told me about. He's a sales manager for a startup company, very high pressure sales job, and he manages a team of salespeople. And one thing he just tries to coach them on is that when they talk to a prospect, they have to think of themselves as the equal of the person who's deciding whether or not to buy their service. And, I've been in sales, and I think that it was hard to picture that, because I go in and I've got a product and I'm selling it. And this person, if they decide to buy the product, I'm going to get a commission. But if you reframe it and say, look, I believe in what I'm selling, and this person has an opportunity to get the benefits of what I'm selling, that we are approaching it as equals. So my friend is teaching his salespeople to kind of reset the power dynamic when they're, heading somewhere and trying to make a sale. And the many types of power, as Andrew said, there's power if somebody has more money than another person. There's power in all different kinds of dimensions. And, I could end up being like a centipede trying to keep track of my feet if I let this get too much into my head when I'm trying to have a natural conversation with someone. But so far, I've enjoyed playing with it, and I'm really glad I asked Andrew that question. And I'm really glad that he was able to write such an entertaining story. I haven't read The Altruists yet. I think it's on my list because I'd be very interested to see how that story plays out. writing entertaining stories that ask something of the reader, which is, that's what he said. I think that's why he's getting great reviews. And, that's a sweet spot for a writer. You can, want to be a literary writer and win prizes and do stuff, but your books are kind of difficult. He's clearly not in that camp. He wants to entertain. He wants his books to be fun to read. But he is letting the questions that kind of are chewing on him into his writing in what I found to be a very natural way. I think that's a pretty promising profile for a young writer. I didn't have a time to ask him in my conversation with him, but I heard in another interview that he did with WGBH, the local NPR station in Boston, that he has started working on his third novel, and it's a kind of similar. It follows a family, probably some of those similar issues that we talked about, but it starts at the beginning of the 20th century and ends at the end of the 20th century. So 100 years of family history, obviously generations. And it was fun to see that his experience of writing this novel, which took him back to 2013 in a way that he wanted to do some research and find out, well, what was really going on in the Obama years and what sorts of things need to be in a book that's set at that time. He was alive then, and he was 17. And for this book, he has to do research about times that well before he was born. And so that's another aspect of his writing odyssey, is to see that one book kind of sows the seeds for the next book, and this book that's coming out, whenever it comes out next, is going to be a much broader canvas that he'll be able to paint on as a very accomplished writer. As I said, I had talked about the power aspects in my morning journal, which is something I put up each weekday morning. It's a 5-minute audio file that you can enable on an Alexa device, an Echo Show or other Echo device. If you'd like to hear what I had to say about that topic, you could just send me an email at len@sanibeljournal.org, and I'll be glad to email you back the files for those. I guess the last couple of days I've been teasing out more thoughts about power, and including some of the comments that my grandson James had to say about it. That's it for the Kindle Chronicles from Ocean Park, Maine. Thanks for listening. I'm not sure when the next episode will be. As you can tell, I'm nowhere near a weekly rhythm anymore, but when I have a chance to connect with an author that's as fun to talk with, and the book is as enjoyable as Hope by Andrew Ridker was, I'll jump on it and be back in your feed with a new episode. Thanks for listening. Bye.